All right. Well, today I wanted to talk about why I think dating is much harder for Gen Z men. This is kind of like a different type of video. This is kind of looking at the dating lens of Gen Z men from like more of a macro perspective. It's also based off my own perspective as a millennial guy and also from talking with a few guys from Gen Z. I could definitely be off on my thoughts, so feel free in the comments to put your perspective on this as a Gen Z guy. I think the biggest reason why dating is harder for Gen Z men has to do with social media. So Gen Z women grew up with apps like Instagram, TikTok, and were able to see a plethora of like super good looking guys and super famous guys. And I think this access to these types of guys, like the 0.01%, made the vast majority of like the local guys at her school kind of seem boring in comparison. And it's like, I think a lot of these Gen Z girls, because they had access to these like super famous guys, super good looking guys on like TikTok and Instagram, they're crushing on these like 0.01% guys, while the dudes at like their local school like seemed very, very dull in comparison. Whereas like with millennial girls, I can say from experience, like Instagram didn't really become popular until like 2014, but really not until like 2016. And TikTok wasn't even a thing in the US until 2018. So like millennial girls didn't grow up having access to like super, super good looking like male models and super famous guys until they're already like well into their mid to late 20s. Whereas attractive women from Gen Z can literally like DM a celebrity or like super good looking male model and like get a response. Like this wasn't a thing for millennial women. Like millennial women had like MySpace. They had like Facebook, and like I said, Instagram didn't really become popular until a lot of the millennial girls were already in their mid to late 20s. So like I didn't even have a Facebook until like my senior year of high school, and most girls and guys my age didn't even have an Instagram until like 2014, 2015, and like nobody really used it that much. Like all the guys and girls that I went to college with, like even pretty attractive like girls, like they barely used Instagram that much. Like they might have posted like some group photos from like parties or like a travel photo here and there, but it definitely wasn't like a thing like, Gen Z women and Gen Z guys use it. And there were definitely millennial guys and girls who like used it, but like most people didn't. Like Instagram was really a place to put up like I said, maybe a travel photo or like an occasional group picture. Even some of the most attractive millennial girls didn't really use Instagram that much. And by the time TikTok came out, like I said, a lot of the millennial women were kind of like out of the dating scene by that point with like kids or just using dating apps instead of like using TikTok and Instagram. And to add on to the accessibility of like Gen Z women having access to like the 0.01% guys, they also had access to guys from like neighboring schools, a lot easier through like TikTok and Instagram. Whereas growing up as a millennial, like unless you met a girl from a neighboring school at like the mall or the movie theater, or like you met them at a college party or like somewhere in person, you just didn't have like the same level of access. So like nowadays, Gen Z guys aren't just competing against, guys from their school like millennial guys were, but they're competing against like, these super good looking guys on TikTok and Instagram. They're competing with like, social media influencers, like celebrities that like, these Gen Z women just have access to now through these apps. And I also think when Gen Z guys and girls like grow up with all this technology like Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, social skills, like I don't think they get developed as much. Because a millennial growing up, we spend a lot of our time like outside, playing manhunt, capture the flag, tackle football, pick up basketball, kickball, like you name it, like riding bikes around the neighborhood. A lot of millennials didn't even have iPhones until they were in college. Like I didn't even have an iPhone until I was in like my third year of college. Like I had the classic like flip phone in high school and like early college. So scrolling on all these apps, like it really wasn't a thing until like we were graduating from college. So you're used to meeting women in person at bars and clubs and like walking up to them to talk to them. And I feel like that's way less of a thing nowadays. I feel like younger Gen Z guys and girls, like they're not riding their bike, around the neighborhood and like playing manhunt and capture the flag and all those games like we did, as growing up as millennials. I could be totally off about that, but I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm out of touch there. But I think with Gen Z guys and Gen Z girls in general, like I feel like they would rather meet someone through like a dating app like Tinder or Hinge or Bumble or Instagram or TikTok. And that definitely has an effect in, I think, making their social skills like worse over time. And like I said, I'm sure, Gen Z guys, Gen Z girls, they probably like have good social skills. Probably a lot of them have good social skills, but I just think with all the technology that has been consumed over the years, and also, something like COVID happened as well, like that also kind of made that worse. I can see that how that could be a problem over time. And like I said, as a byproduct of social media, Gen Z guys and Gen Z girls just don't meet each other as much in person, and it almost is seen like a bit like more taboo to walk up to someone at a bar or club in that generation. And that's definitely a massive generalization, but it's definitely more of a stigma now than, for millennials. And I also think Gen Z men are less likely to approach women, and for a lot of good reasons. They have access to Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, TikTok, Instagram. So like, why would they walk up to, a girl in public when they can just try and shoot their shot online? And that makes total sense. Like if they're using all these apps, like it's a lot easier to like shoot your shot using the app than it is to, walk up to someone in person and risk rejection. And, I also think Gen Z guys are more on game with how modern dating is. Much more than millennial guys were. Like Gen Z guys have just consumed more information online from like YouTube, TikTok, Instagram on how female nature is. They've learned more about how hypergamy works. Watched videos on RP and BP topics, so they just know how dating is, and the access to that information has led them to realize like where they stand within the dating market. Whereas growing up as a millennial, there weren't that many people giving dating advice. Like there definitely were some, but there just weren't that many people talking about things like female nature, hypergamy, the sexual marketplace, like RP, BP topics. So I think a lot of millennial guys didn't really know where they stood, and they would just kind of, approach girls they found attractive in person at like a college bar or, a nightclub or something like that. But as a byproduct, all this knowledge Gen Z guys have consumed, they're a lot of them prioritize dating less. And to be honest, like more power to them. I think Gen Z guys are kind of breaking the mold and being the first generation to like prioritize like experiences and traveling and focusing on their career and focusing on like starting a business and, doing content creation, prioritizing their own happiness over, say, pursuing dating, trying to get married, and like pursuing like a corporate job. I also think Gen Z men and Gen Z women are also super divided nowadays when it comes to politics. And you definitely saw this in like in the election, this past year. Like it was funny because like the vast majority of like Gen Z men like voted for Trump, and, we're following like streamers like, Aiden Ross, who was kind of like leading the charge there for the Gen Z guys, like endorsing Trump. And, the vast majority of Gen Z women were voting for Harris and like, following someone like Taylor Swift or, Call Her Daddy podcast, who were both endorsing Harris. So I think like that's led to a bit of like jadedness between Gen Z men and Gen Z women, whereas I didn't really experience that as a millennial guy. Like politics weren't even like even a minor criteria on how millennial women like, gauged millennial men on if they wanted to date them or not. Like for millennial women, it was more like, do they find the guy attractive, and, or do they vibe with him? That was like pretty much it. Whereas like, I feel like politics nowadays, like a lot of Gen Z, women look at Gen Z men like they're, like they're bad people. And then Gen Z men kind of view Gen Z women as like, oh, they're just going to try to steal half my money. They're going to cheat on me. They're going to fuck me over. So there's like this kind of bitter, like jadedness towards each other that wasn't really a thing with between millennial men and millennial women. And on top of that as well, like I think the economy also has something to do with it as well, because if you think of macroeconomics, like inflation's gotten increasingly worse over the past 5 years, and some of that had to do with COVID, some of that had to do with supply chains being disrupted from COVID, and interest rates are a lot higher now these days, so it's a lot harder to buy a home. And I think Gen Z guys in general, like especially like they're coming out of college in their mid-20s just trying to get their their career started, they have a lot less purchasing power than millennial guys and Gen X, and you have definitely way less purchasing power than baby boomers back in the day. But that has a big ripple effect on dating between Gen Z men and Gen Z women. It's just a lot harder to picture yourself having that white picket fence when inflation is super high and interest rates are super high as well. And like I said, that's kind of my take on it. And I'm super glad as a millennial guy, like I didn't that apps like TikTok and Instagram weren't around when I was in high school and I was in college, or at least weren't around for a long period of time while I was in college. So I didn't have to compete with like super good looking guys and super famous guys. I definitely think there are other reasons why dating as a Gen Z guy is harder that I didn't cover, but I think for the most part, those are the major reasons. Like I said, this is just my take, and like I said, I could be totally off here. Gen Z guys, feel free to leave a comment on why you think dating is harder as a Gen Z guy. Be interested to hearing about that. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like, feel free to comment down below, and feel free to subscribe. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care.